We're going to, so we'll go back to Proverbs chapter 1. All right, so when you say that you're going to do a study on Proverbs, it seems like a lot of people react very positively to that. Some say, oh, I love Proverbs, or Proverbs is my favorite book. And after you start getting into the teaching of Proverbs, then people begin to start saying, oh no, and woe is me. And it don't seem to be quite as much fun as the idea of it was when you actually start digging in. Proverbs is extremely practical. It gets right down where we live every day. It certainly has theology in the book, but it is definitely not any sort of abstract philosophy. We talked about that somewhat last time. In my own experience and my own thinking and of others, I think there's two problems that seem to be most common when we're approaching Proverbs and it's such a practical book. And one of those is looking at Proverbs as just a collection of wise words to live by. And so they're kind of like the funny sayings that your grandmother had for everything. And I don't know if you had a grandmother like that, but I did. She had a funny saying for everything, every situation, every circumstance. It seemed like she could just pull those things somewhere out of her brain. And that sort of wisdom, we feel like, we can take it or leave it. Or we could just kind of pick and choose. So Proverbs is like a nice open buffet there, and we can just kind of pick what we want. Of course, the problem is that Proverbs is not just, it's very practical, but it's not just about what works. It's also about what is right, which is extremely important. And it shows us in the book that the stakes are actually life and death between wisdom and folly. Well, that second problem would be looking at Proverbs as universal absolutes. And so if we look at Proverbs as a universal absolute, then we think, okay, so this proverb must always be the case at all times and in all conditions and circumstances and what have you. And that leads to us easily dismissing a proverb if we find a situation where the proverb doesn't seem to hold up. So, just like some of the statements we have in Proverbs that would seem to imply that the righteous and the wise are very prosperous in life, that they get wealth and such. You say, well, that's not always the case. All right. So we can just, shove Proverbs aside. It's just not relevant for our modern day. And of course, once again, that would be a mistake. And it would be a mistake of misunderstanding what a proverb is and what this book is about. And that's sort of what we talked about last time, just sort of getting oriented to the book of Proverbs and what it is that we're dealing with. So, obviously, the primary theme in Proverbs is that of wisdom. So, what is wisdom? Somebody give me a definition of wisdom. Refusing to incriminate oneself, is that wisdom? Yeah. Okay. All right. No other brave souls want to venture a definition of Proverbs. Wisdom to know God. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So, one of the things that we see just from what the response we got is that there's many facets to wisdom. Um, it's not, sort of just one thing. Um, and so, even if you look at like our English word wisdom, so I looked up the Oxford English Dictionary, and it gave the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And it's really not too bad. It's not even too bad in terms of the biblical use of the term. But that's what our study is about tonight. So we want to find out, what does Proverbs mean by the word wisdom and the related terms that are used with it. And of course, we're on the right track of understanding, obviously knowing God. I mean, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So that's what we want to begin with. So here in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, um, we looked at this last time. We talked about it sort of being like an introduction to the book. So we're going to read this again. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. All right, so last time we focused more on the proverbs and the dark sayings and the puzzling sayings, in other words, the form of teaching of wisdom teaching. And now we want to talk about more about wisdom itself. And so in these verses, we see a group of words. In fact, there are 9 of them in these verses. Words that are either wisdom or they are related to wisdom in some way. And they're almost used at times sort of interchangeably. They don't all mean exactly the same thing. But what we see from this and from the usage is that these words all work together. All right. So let's let's just talk about these words and get our definitions of these words. So in verse 2, to know wisdom, the first wisdom that you run into there, that is the Hebrew word hakmah, and it means technical skill or experience. So it appears in verse 2 and in verse 7. This word hokmah is most often translated as wisdom. That's by far the majority of the time. And it's a word that generally means skill or ability. In other words, it doesn't exclude knowledge, but it doesn't really primarily mean knowledge. It's a word that is used of the craftsmen who were able to take the plans. Remember that God gave Moses these plans for the tabernacle and for all those furnishings. So Moses took these plans and gave these plans to these craftsmen to whom God had given wisdom. The Spirit had given wisdom. So the craftsmen who built the tabernacle and its furnishings did so through the skill of wisdom that they possess. So the term is used of them, Exodus chapter 28 and verse number 3, Exodus chapter 31, verses 3 to 6, and Exodus chapter 36 and verse number 1. And then, of course, later when the temple was built under Solomon's reign, once again, there were skilled craftsmen, artisans, we would probably even call them in today's terminology. These were highly skilled and able to manufacture and build the temple and all these furnishings and things that were necessary. And so similar words is used of them again. The word is also used of sailors who are able to successfully navigate and sail the sea and reach their destination. That's Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse number 8. It is used of military strategists in Isaiah chapter 10 and verse number 3, those who are able to plan and execute a plan of warfare and such. And it's also used in Proverbs of 4 different creatures that appear in nature and all the one thing they all have in common is that they all survive by skill that Proverbs refers to as wisdom. Same word that is used. In fact, it's a root that is used. So in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 24 to 28, there be four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. And that word for wise is the root from which the Hokmah comes here in wisdom in Proverbs in chapter 1. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. The conies are but a feeble folk, yet they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet they go forth all of them by bands. The spider taketh hold with her hands and is in kings' palaces. So these four creatures are used. And remember how we talked about with wisdom teachers that there's an element of observing what is going on, observing the world around you and discerning wisdom from it. And so here's another example of that. Here's these four different types of creatures in nature, and they are surviving, and their life is lived through the skill that they have. Of course, it's innate within them as God created them with that instinct. So this word hokmah is a controlling word. All right, so this is the main word for wisdom in Proverbs. It appears 39 times in the book, and the aim of Proverbs is to teach this wisdom. So the aim of Proverbs is to teach the skill of living righteously. And we see that coming out in this introduction as well, because it's exercised particularly in the realm in verse 3 of justice and judgment and equity. So it's not just simply the skill for successful living, but the skill for righteous living in this world. All right, so the second term that we encounter, this appears in verse 4 and in verse 7, translated here as knowledge, and da'at is the Hebrew term. The word means perception or understanding, and it's what you can think of as the result of learning. So if you have learned a new skill, or you have learned some new information that you can apply, then you have that understanding, you have that knowledge of whatever that it was. So it's most often translated as knowledge. And knowledge, the way this word is used in the Hebrew Old Testament, it's knowledge that can be gained through learning, which can come in a number of ways. It's also knowledge that can be imparted. So, in other words, it can be divinely imparted to someone, knowledge being given by God, in other words. Now, the common emphasis of the word is that it's something that is received. All right, so you're going to notice that about all of these terms. Wisdom is not something that we're just born with. Now, obviously, people are born with different levels of giftedness and intelligence and that sort of thing. It's kind of wisdom that Proverbs is speaking of. It's not something that we're just born with, it's something that we acquire. This word is used 40 times in Proverbs, and so it is very commonly associated with wisdom. The two really are inseparable when we are considering wisdom. All right, so the next term that you want to think about is in verses 2, 3, and 7, instruction. This is the Hebrew term musar, and it's most of the time it is translated as instruction, but sometimes it's translated as correction. All right, so in English, if we think about someone being instructed, we think of them more or less just receiving information and of being taught something. But really, this word is much more holistic than that. It has both the ideas of positive instruction, but also of correction. So it's more of a view of what you might say discipling or discipleship than just mere instruction. And correction is actually in the book of Proverbs is a good measuring stick for how wise that a person is and how whether or not they are growing in wisdom, because how a person responds to correction says a lot about whether they are wise or whether they are foolish. Remember, at the end of verse 7, fools despise instruction. Now, the word communicates some difficulty and effort in gaining wisdom. In other words, having to receive instruction and even having to receive correction is something that doesn't come easily through just a casual interest. This word is also used a lot, 30 times in Proverbs, so right up there with wisdom and knowledge. Um, the next word is in verse number 2. They're translated as understanding at the end of that verse, the Hebrew term bina. And it means understanding or insight or discernment. Most of the time, it's translated understanding when it appears. And it has a root that's used in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse number 9. So when Solomon was asking for wisdom, one of the reasons why he asked for wisdom was that he might be able to discern between good and evil. And it's that discern, that word comes from the root there. That's the root of the word we have here. Solomon requests wisdom that he may be able to discern between. So that preposition also helps. In other words, it communicates the idea of reasoning, of comprehending, and of determining. So you might think of maybe evaluating, discerning. You could think of it in terms of a decision. And so, I could do this or I could do that. And working through a process of reasoning these options, these ways, and determining, which is best and which is the right way to go. The word's used about 14 times in Proverbs. The next word that we encounter in verse number 3, the instruction of wisdom, that word wisdom there, and that's actually a different word in the Hebrew than the first one. This is the word sakal, and it means prudence or practical wisdom. So it's oftentimes translated as understand or as wise or wisdom. And the word indicates probably what we would think of as someone just having good sense. So they're able to comprehend, they're able to observe, comprehend, and respond or act appropriately. They just have good practical sense, used about 13 times in Proverbs. All right, the next word that we encounter in verse 4 is the word translated there, subtlety. That's orma in the Hebrew. And it's a word that actually means plotting or planning. And most of the time, it's translated as guile or subtlety. And it's a word that can be used positively or negatively. And the context is going to have to determine how that it's used. It's what we might think of as being shrewd or clever. It's the ability to make, you might say, successful plans, being able to plan something effectively. Now, again, that's something that can be used for evil. And in fact, oftentimes it is. When the word is used, it's oftentimes in a negative consequence, speaking of the evil plotting and the evil planning of wicked men. But it can also be for good. And obviously, it's the good usage here. And it's used only about 3 times in Proverbs. So these last few words are not used as often, but they help to fill out this picture. The next word we encounter in verse number 4, their discretion at the end of the verse. And masima in the Hebrew, it means plotting or planning. It's in fact oftentimes translated as discretion or even device. And so sometimes it's qualified as wicked devices in that negative context. So it can be used positively, can be used negatively. There's in fact 3 negative examples in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 2. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse number 17, and Proverbs chapter 24 and verse number 8. Again, it's what we think of as being shrewd and clever. It's very similar to the previous word there, used about 8 times in Proverbs. Then we have in verse number 5, Another word that is used, that learning. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. All right, so this word is lakah in the Hebrew, and it refers to something received or received teaching. This word is most of the times translated either as learning or as doctrine. And it is used of a growth in understanding truth. So the wise man will hear and he will increase learning. So hearing and means he will receive teaching and he will grow from it. Used about 6 times in the book of Proverbs. And then we have the next word in verse number 5, that is counsels. He shall attain unto wise counsels. This word, tabulat in the Hebrew, it means guidance or steerage. And the word is translated mostly as counsel. One time it's translated as good advice. So the acquiring of wisdom means heeding good counsel, being one who receives instruction. And it's used 5 times in the book of Proverbs. So there are different ways that wisdom is learned, and some of that obviously can come through experience. In other words, of making the wrong choice, going the wrong way, making a mistake, or what have you. And then wisdom would be learning from that. Of course, ideally, wisdom is received through instruction. In other words, we don't have to experience every bad possible thing in order to understand that's a really bad idea. Maybe I shouldn't do that again. Well, no, having wisdom is ideally that, first of all, you never do that in the first place because you have received wisdom and you have understood, you've increased your learning. That's the wrong way to go, and I'll not go that way. Okay, so there are a few other minor terms in Proverbs, but this group of words fills out really the full picture of wisdom in Proverbs. This is the wisdom that we are instructed to pursue and to obtain above all else. So Proverbs 4:7 says, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. So wisdom refers, this is just sort of the way that I brought all these words together. Wisdom refers to developing capacity and skill for righteous living through the receiving of instruction and correction and learning from experience. And I'll give you that again if you want to write that down. And again, this is just sort of my composite of wisdom from taking all of these words together. Wisdom refers to developing capacity and skill for righteous living through the receiving of instruction and correction and learning from experience. Okay, did everybody get that? Do we need to go another time? Okay. All right. So now that brings us, as we've gotten an idea of what the wisdom is that Proverbs is speaking of. And of course, even at the beginning, some of the things that were said, and understanding and the knowledge of God, and we could add the fear of God, and a lot of those kind of things, all those things are tending that way. So we have this picture of the wisdom that Proverbs is written to teach us. So the question then becomes, how do we get wisdom? How do we acquire it? So we're going to look at some verses here in Proverbs. First of all, Proverbs is telling us that wisdom is accessible. In other words, it's possible to acquire. So here in chapter 1, while we're here, look at verse 20. Wisdom crieth without. She uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the openings of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity, and scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge? Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you, because I have called. I'm sorry, I was going to stop there at verse number 23. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I'll pour out my spirit unto you, and I'll make known my words unto you. Okay, so in this description, Solomon says wisdom is crying in the streets, crying in the chief places of concourse, in the openings of the gates. And if we flip over to chapter 9 here in Proverbs, verse 1 says, Wisdom hath builded her house. She hath hewn out her 7 pillars. She hath killed her beast. She hath mingled her wine. She hath also furnished her table. She hath sent forth her maidens. She crieth upon the highest places of the city. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. As for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, Come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine which I have mingled. Forsake the foolish and live. Go in the way of understanding. These pictures are describing wisdom. Wisdom is here personified as a woman who is going about and calling out. And she's in all these places. She's in high places of the city, and she's in the gates of the city, and she's in the marketplace of the city, and she's in the streets, and she's going all about. So the picture that we're being given is that wisdom is accessible. It's not like wisdom is so far away from us that we could never get it or we could never get to it. Wisdom is accessible. In fact, Solomon is saying here, just listen. Open your ears and listen. Wisdom is calling out continually. And everyone that will hear, that will turn in, and that will go and sit at wisdom's table is going to be fed with wisdom. So wisdom is accessible, and it's possible to acquire, but we have to understand that it comes from God and that we must seek it. So in chapter 2, Solomon writes here beginning in verse 1, My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding. So think about that, the inclining of the ear. In other words, do you have an ear to hear? Do you have an ear to hear wisdom? Or is your heart applied, or your mind, is it applied to understanding? Yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So he likens the pursuit of wisdom to the pursuit of a buried treasure. And how many of us, if we were fully convinced or persuaded that out behind our house was a buried treasure, was a fortune that would make us the richest person in the world, how many of us would be out there digging, metal detectors going? We'd be doing something. We might even hire a crew to come in and help us. We'd be trying to get at it if we were really convinced that it was there. But that's what he says about wisdom, that we should be pursuing wisdom even more than we would pursue a buried treasure of silver and gold. So it comes from God, but we must also seek it. We must go after it. Now, it's also important that we understand, just as we were looking at these various terms that are used about wisdom, that wisdom comes oftentimes in the form of correction. That there's instruction, yes, but there's also correction. And in fact, the word for correction that we talked about earlier can be quite stern and sometimes translated as chastisement. So there can be difficult, tough correction. Verse 23, notice that in chapter 1. Wisdom crying out and says, Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you, and I will make known my words unto you. So we have to understand that the pursuit of wisdom means we must receive correction along with instruction. Well, to receive correction means that we have to turn from our natural tendencies. So in chapter 9 and verse 4, wisdom is crying out, "Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. As for him that wanteth understanding, she saith to him, Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine which I have mingled. Forsake the foolish and live and go in the way of understanding." Verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse number 12. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Now, we'll talk in a much later lesson about what Proverbs has to say about man and the condition of man and all of that. But just suffice it to say that we're born fools. We're not born wise, we're born fools. And we have a natural tendency in us toward folly. And in order to acquire wisdom, we have to turn from it. We have to turn away from that natural folly that is within us. And that also means that we have to be teachable. Proverbs chapter 9, verse number 9, give instruction to a wise man, and what? He will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning. And again, a lot of what determines or manifests whether you're dealing with a fool or a wise person is how they will receive instruction and correction. So we have to be teachable. If you've ever had an experience, maybe at work or something like that, I've had a few of those experiences of trying to train and to teach someone in a job. And of course, they come in day one convinced that they knew everything already and really just didn't listen to a word that I had to say. And, then just proceeded to make a lot of mistakes and cause a lot of problems, not only for them, but for a lot of other people as well. And you've had that experience. And I would also dare say you've been the one that thought you knew everything already. And hopefully after a while and some hard knocks, you were humbled a little bit and became a lot more teachable. And we've all had that experience. So to get wisdom, we have to be teachable, which also means we have to be open to criticism and to advice. Proverbs chapter 13, verse number 10, only by pride cometh contention, but with the well advised is wisdom. Chapter 17 and verse number 10. A reproof entereth more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. So we have to be teachable to get wisdom. We have to be open to criticism and advice. Now, we'll look at some of these things a little more in depth as we get further into the study of these different topics. But we'll say that being open to criticism and advice doesn't mean that we have to take every piece of advice we receive, because what we're going to find out as we proceed is that wisdom is not the only voice that's calling out to us all the time. Folly is also calling out to us all the time and is a real danger to us because we already have within us a natural bent toward folly. So we have to have wisdom to discern what voice it is that we are hearing. Is this criticism coming from a wise person? And I need to heed this advice, and I need to receive it and follow it. Is this criticism coming from a fool? And for me to follow it would make me a fool as well. We have to have that sort of discernment to be able to judge between both of those different realities. Okay, so that's actually all that I had for tonight. We are going to, or really next time, we'll look at folly or foolishness. Obviously, wisdom and folly are the two contrasting themes in Proverbs. So we'll do the similar thing for folly. Then after that, we begin to get into to some of the individual topics. So, any questions or anything about our lesson tonight? Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Uh, fools despise wisdom and destruction. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, and I don't, off the top of my head, that exact word, I'm not certain of what's being used there because you're right. I mean, it can be hate, or it can simply be to the point of ignore. This is of no consequence. So, just move on. And what you find in Proverbs, and what we'll see actually next week when we look at fools and folly in Proverbs, is that there's a range of folly. There's a range that goes from simple, which might just be uninformed. It would be ignorant, but not in an insulting way of saying ignorant. If you don't know something, you're ignorant of it. So it would be sort of that ignorance of being simple. Then you go all the way till you get to the mocker and the scorner. And when you get to that point, you're getting to those that just hate it. They hate the instruction and the correction of wisdom, whereas the simple is just ignorant of it. And then you have others that maybe just esteem it lightly. So it goes across a range there. Now, again, this particular word I'd have to look up. I don't remember exactly which one is used here, or even the particular word for fools at this point. So maybe when we look at that next week, I'll make a point of looking that up. Let me make a note here. Equity in verse 3, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. Mhm. Well, equity does have the idea of fairness. But again, like you say, a lot of people use that word, but that doesn't mean that what they mean by it is actually fair. So it would be fairness in turn, right along with justice and judgment. Judgment being the judgments of the Lord. So, in other words, what He has pronounced. So it would be fairness in terms of what God has commanded and what God has instructed, not necessarily what I think would be fair to me, or what I think might be fair to someone else, but actually according to God's judgment. So but it does have the idea of fairness with it. Maybe a good example would be the way that the law forbids judging a poor person by a different standard than a rich person. So they're both supposed to receive a just judgment. In other words, their case is heard, the case is established by the two or three witnesses, all these things, and then whatever the law prescribes in that situation is supposed to be the judgment that's given. And because it's a rich person, or not maybe wealthy, or it could be someone of influence or power, or someone that's poor, and someone that doesn't have family and connections. The law forbids giving a different judgment to them because of their persons. So that would be equity in judgment. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, if not, then we'll go to the Lord in a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Almighty Father in heaven, Lord, thank you so much for the day that you've given us. And we thank you for this opportunity that we have to look into your word. And as we progress in this study of wisdom in the book of Proverbs, I pray, Father, that you would help us to be those that would receive instruction and receive correction. And Father, that we would seek and pursue after wisdom, that we would go in the right way, in the way of righteousness, in the way of truth, in the way of life. Father, I do pray that you would be with those not able to be with us tonight, and do pray that you would um, continue to be with them, and that they would be able to meet with us again the next time we gather on the Lord's Day. I do pray you'd go with us to our homes and be with us throughout the rest of this week, preparing hearts and minds for services on the Lord's Day. All these things I pray in the holy name of Jesus Christ. And amen.